postdoctoral fellow at the Center of Criminology, and I'll be chairing the first session of our second day, which is on homicide, the mechanisms. Before we get into that, I just wanted to point out, I don't know if all of you heard, but we had a phone call, the organizers had a phone call from a prominent national broadcaster yesterday. Having heard that this fascinating conference was going on, they requested if they could urgently interview a victim of homicide. Unfortunately, Guy and SaVI were unable to assist. So, we have three speakers this morning. The first will be, let me just check, yes. Sebastian van As. Sebastian is head of the trauma unit at Red Cross Children's Hospital. He's been there since the year 2000. He's the president of Child Safe South Africa, and he's authored over 200 publications and presented over 200 papers. Guy Lamb, as you all know, is the director of SaVI. He's been at UCT for quite a few years, and before that he was the program head of the arms management program at the ISS. And he also served on the UN Security Council's panel of experts and the UN Small Arms Control Standards Experts Reference Group. Calvin Mole is a researcher in the Division of Forensic Medicine at Medicine and Toxicology at UCT, and I can recommend having a look at his publication list. He's a very creative title author. We're going to begin with Sebastian, and each speaker will present for 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll open up for questions. Thanks very much.
Good morning. My name is Sebastian, and I work as a trauma surgeon. And as we saw yesterday, I really thought it was a fascinating day, and I learned a lot. And as Kelly mentioned, the way we think and look at trauma is completely dependent on our perspective. Now, my perspective is probably slightly different from most of your guys, your perspective. And it's from trauma, from a pediatric, from a child trauma point of view. So I would like to share that this morning with you. In the year 2000, when I started working at the Children's Hospital, we saw that South Africa is a very violent country. And if you look at this table, sorry. And this is the results of the NIM study, and you can see that firearm injuries was the #1 killer at that time. So it's in the meantime quite a long time ago. That was the situation when I arrived at the Children's Hospital. In that year, more than 800 kids were killed with firearms, and the total homicides in that year was 25,000, which fortunately has been reduced since then. Over 50%, 2000 was the first year in which the number of deaths by firearm exceeded other mechanisms. It was the first year as far as I remember. And besides the 25,000 people who were murdered, there were also 22,000 attempts of murder. So in that year there was a anti-gun alliance created under the leadership of an NGO, Gun Free South Africa. And basically what we try to do is we try to mobilize social capital in our society. So we want to bring everyone together around guns, or actually against guns. And we promoted a new Firearm Bill. Now, the new Firearm Bill is a completely complicated legal document of hundreds and hundreds of pages, but I think the crucial things in this law was raising the minimum age from 16 to 21. So where before you could get a gun when you were 16, now you had to be 21. You need a competency certificate, so not anyone can just acquire a gun. Like in the United States, you open a banking account if you're 16 and you're given a rifle. But you actually have to have a competency certificate, so you must have done a course which is teaching you how dangerous a gun is. And then, of course, there's a number of gun-free zones. So places of, I was amazed the first time when I came in South Africa 35 years ago. I went to church and I saw there people entering the church with their guns on their holster. I thought it was quite inappropriate, but at that time it was still quite normal. But at the moment it's not allowed anymore. So for the new Firearm Bill, the first parliamentary hearings were in the year 2000. It was adopted in 2002, but the legal wheels turned slowly, and it was only implemented in 2004. So I don't know if you can read this picture, but so often you hear the argument, guns don't kill people, it's people who kill people. But, it's much more difficult to kill someone without a gun than with a gun. So what we did, looking at these, at gunshots in children, and in my hospital we only treat children up to the age of 12, we did a systematic review of our database. Every child who comes in our trauma unit is captured in the data captured in a database. We've been doing this for the last 25 years. And we looked for this particular study from 1991 to 2010. And we included all firearms to children. So, as I said earlier, only under the age of 12, so small children. It drains most of the western part of the Cape Town municipality. And all the serious gunshots usually arrive at our place. And we see in total about 10,000 kids here. That's the total number of patients. So if you looked at gunshots only, we saw 476 children under the age of 12 who were shot. A child who was shot the mechanism is completely different. The majority of adults who are shot is two adults or two teenagers having a fight. The one draws a gun and points at the other one and shoots them on purpose. This is a very rare mechanism in children. The vast majority of children are caught in crossfire. So there's two people fighting and the child is just hit by a stray bullet. So it's actually, it's a type of measurement of how many shots are fired in the community. It's a very morbid type of measurement, but it says more about what's going on in the townships. So that 65 of the known causes, 65% of the known causes are kids shot in crossfire. Now I just want to talk about our limited understanding of abuse. And I'm always fascinated by the fact that most people think they know what is abuse, but we don't really know. There's very little literature on what exactly it constitutes. And to give you an example, I'll just talk about, just in order to prime you on what I'm going to say about gunshots. If we think about child abuse, we've got this, most people have this picture, most students have this picture in their mind. So it's a dark, a big person hitting an innocent child. But there is also something like this. A lot of violence occurs in places of very massive density, population density, as we heard yesterday. Often 5 or 8 people living in a 1 or a 2-room shack. And if these adults are fighting, then obviously kids can be more or less accidentally injured. And there's also what we call shielding, in which case in most of abuse there's intoxication of drugs, so alcohol or dacha, or tick in the Western Cape. And whenever a man comes home intoxicated and his wife probably makes a remark about where's the money, and the money is finished now, and then they come into an altercation and they fight, and the mother may be breastfeeding a child or sitting with a child on the lap, and she may use the child as a shield in the hope that this guy is not going to hit her. But obviously, if he's intoxicated and if he's gross, there's no rational argument, so he will hit. And we see a lot of kids being hit, and actually from all the children with head injuries, 50% of them are hit in this mechanism. So they were not the intended target. The target was an other adult, and the child was just in the way. Now this is a gunshot. This is a policeman. We talked yesterday about policemen. I think many of the policemen are angry. Most of them are going home with their gun, and that's not a good idea. This is a policeman who had burnout, a nervous breakdown, and he tried to shoot his wife. His wife was carrying the baby, and you can see the bullet went through the spinal cord of the child. You can still see contusion of the upper part of the lungs. And this child was shot through the upper part of the cervical spine and is tetraplegic, which means cannot move anything down from the neck onwards anymore. And it was a small child, he's in the institution now. It's a tragedy. And this is another child, who was also from the Cape Flats. There was a gang fight during the night, and this was a family that lived in a Wendy type of house. There was a gang fight during the night, and they heard the shots. In the morning, they went to pick up their child from the cot, and one of the bullets had traveled through the wall of the Wendy house, through the wall of the cot, into the baby. So the bullet is sitting next to the heart. So it's a tragedy. I just want to say something about the availability of firearms. People say it doesn't make a difference, but this is quite a frightening statistic, I think. In America, we know that a very big cause of traumatic deaths are caused by firearms. But what you may not know is that in the last 10 years, for every United States soldier killed in Afghanistan, 13 American children lost their lives due to gun violence. Now, the total number of people being murdered by handguns is going down, but not in the Western Cape. But I think there are good reasons for that. And here's just some of the newspapers. There's been cases in which people, police people, sold guns to the gangs. And amazing enough, even one, I have to admit, one of my own doctors who worked in my unit 10 years ago, a reasonably good doctor, but he recently was in court and he was arrested for selling guns to a gang on the Cape Flats. So this is the physical effects. I don't talk about the psychological effects and the long-term effects, but obviously it's very negative for the development of victims, siblings, parents, neighbors, and children in the social vicinity. I think guns are usually celebrated in the media, and I get extremely upset if I switch on the TV, which I hardly do anymore, on Friday night, and you get SABC 1, SABC 2, SABC 3, and ETV, and all of them are violent movies. I really think our society is saturated enough with violence. I can't believe that we're making fun of it by broadcasting it so broadly. Children who grow up with guns might easily be tempted to use them later, obviously. And in these movies, you must remember, children, they are not like adults. We've got a filter. We can understand if there's some guy shooting, that he's not always the hero, and that that there is a victim somewhere who's ending up in hospital, often permanently damaged or paralyzed. But they are never portrayed in the movies. In all the movies, you see the guy who's shooting is the hero. People who are shot are the losers. You know, you don't see them anymore. We see them, of course, in the hospital, and I'm sure Professor Nichols sees them as well. So I think the bottom line is that we can make a difference, and Andy made reference to that yesterday. If you looked at the statistics of the children from 1991 to 2000, you can see there was a significant increase. And then here, the first negotiations about the new firearm started, and it was implemented here in the next couple of years, and you see that led to a almost 70% reduction of children presenting to the hospital with gunshots. And these are small kids. None of them were criminals. They were just hit as innocent victims. So what is interesting is that there was a backlog with the police of supplying weapons. And in 2011, because they had so much complaints from hunting and rifle associations, they decided to release over 1 million licenses in a 9-month period. And I think that was the beginning of disaster, because you can see since that time we've seen a massive increase of children presenting with firearm injuries. So just you saw these graphs yesterday from Richard Matsopoulos. So this is after the law was implemented. You see a significant reduction, and look at Johannesburg and look at Cape Town, the green line. From 2001 to 2005, in these 4 years, was nearly a halving of number of people being killed. This is not children, this is adults and children. And the interesting thing is that it was only firearm, because other modes of violence remained exactly the same. There was no difference. So it must have been a result from the new firearm bill. So in conclusion, Mr. Chairman, guns have a devastating effect on our society. Children are disproportionately affected by guns, not only as direct victims, but it also causes them great distress if anyone is shot in their environment, stress. And I think that the minimum age for people having guns should be 25, when your frontal lobe is at least matured. So I always like to end with Nelson Mandela. He said in his first speech in Parliament that the way we are doing as a society should not be measured in monetary terms or in the economy or in infrastructure. It really should be measured in how our children are doing. And our children are not doing well. A big project just a short while ago by Seoul City, it shows that 90% of the kids going to school feel extremely insecure. Insecure for violence, but also insecure because they have to negotiate busy roads, crossings. So our kids are not doing well, and our society is therefore not doing well, and we should change that. And I thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much, Sebastian. I work on police, and I've always tried to push for sharing with the public insight into the lived experience of police officers, because I think it's very easy for us to forget that they're not just people in uniform doing a job, but I think there are a whole lot of people who are entrenched in the criminal justice system and the experience of violence in South Africa whom we forget, and trauma surgeons are obviously a big part of that. So I think we're grateful for you sharing that with us today. And the trends suggesting firearm legislation has helped prevent deaths are promising. I think Guy might also have something to share with us in that regard. So please welcome Guy.
From the tall person to the short person. Good morning, everyone. Great to see you all again this morning. What I'm going to be talking about, and I've titled this, Whodunit, the Enigma of the firearm drop in South Africa, because I want to challenge sort of some conventional views that we have about firearm violence and firearm control, because it's something I've been thinking about for a very long time and sort of scratching my head about as well. So I'm going to kind of respectfully kind of disagree with a few of my colleagues about particularly the role of the Firearms Control Act within South Africa. I think it's played a role, but I think we need to be looking in other places to try and find some explanation for this. So this presentation is very much based on preliminary research. So it's early stages, it's very much kind of hypotheses that some evidence is indicating there might be some value in it. And I am using police data, and police data comes with all sorts of challenges, but I'm trying to use them in the most robust aspects of that police data. And it's trying to speak to some of the questions that were raised yesterday as well. Jean Redpath asked this question about what are we doing right in certain places. And the kind of case of what I want to look at is I want to go to those places where there's high levels of violence. So it's not the sense that I want to fetishize them clearly. It's about, I think we need to try and understand what's going on there. Maybe there's some explanatory power about what's happening in these places, because we tend to look at things at a very aggregate level. But if we actually zoom into where violence is concentrated, and we know that. We know there are zones of intense danger within South Africa, and there are large zones of safety. And I think we need to go into those places of zones of danger to try and find out what's been happening over the past 20 years, to try and figure out how certain developments have emerged. And so this is SAP's data that was reported in the UN Office Drugs and Crime, homicide, global homicide report. And the issue for me is, and it's sort of been pointed out a number of times, is, so the blue line is the murder rate. So we're talking about police stats here, so we're making use of murder. And then at some point in time, the police brought out numbers of firearm murders. And I mean, the key point here is it peaks at in the sort of financial year, so it's police data 1998, 1999, around 2000, and then starts to drop off. And it's around this time that there is a conversation about, as Sebastian mentioned, a firearms control bill. There's lots of thinking about how do we make South Africa safer. But it's the point that's been made is the act only really comes into effect after sort of late 2004 when the regulations are brought into being. So they were using the old Arms and Ammunition Act prior to that particular point. Lots and lots of loopholes, lots and lots of weaknesses in that. And also within South Africa, we're really good at producing excellent legislation. We have world-class legislation. But the challenge that comes in, as many of us who work in violence, is it's the implementation. And when I start looking at this critically, and I was certainly been one of the voices to say, Firearms Control Act has made a difference, and I certainly think it has over a long term, but trying to explain what sort of happened in this dramatic drop from sort of 2000 to 2008. It's, were we that good that we could actually put a piece of legislation and have such an immediate effect? So Sebastian already went through aspects of the Act, but I think there's one particular aspect that we don't really talk about where my research has taken me, is about within the Act, it gave the police considerable power that on the suspicion that someone has an illegal firearm, on the suspicion that someone has a firearm that's not under their effective control, they can enter your house, your residence, your business premises, and search it and confiscate that firearm. Even if you don't have a firearm, they can go in there, just under that they have this particular suspicion. And we don't really have that conversation about that. So that's a bit of a starting point. I think there's been lots of conversations about the rate of firearms, and there's different data sources here. So in 1998, about 50% of all murders in South Africa were committed with firearms. 2009, it's about 38%. There's some, depending on which data you're looking at, but it's somewhere around, it's about more than a third, around a third of murders are committed with a firearm. It's concentrated on hotspots, so specific sorts of areas, and we know it's particularly high if we look at the sort of 20-year period, so not just looking at the current period, but look at the 20-year period, we're looking at places, the provinces of Gauteng, Western Cape, and KwaZulu-Natal. And within those provinces, there are specific areas which are much more dangerous than others. And we've also had these conversations. It's mainly perpetrated by young men against other young men, mainly perpetrated over the weekend, mainly perpetrated at night. And I think the key thing, the key thing here, which is also where I start asking questions, is about illegal firearms and what impact legislation can have on illegal firearms. Because it's not definitive, but we certainly know that a large proportion of homicides are used with illegal firearms. Illegal firearms are used to commit murder within South Africa because they're concentrated in specific areas by young men who would probably not qualify to get a firearm license, or if applied for a firearm license, would not necessarily get it due to a whole range of risk factors. So this is also just summarizing a lot of things that have been said before, but a sort of an area of research which is developing, and I think Kapana Ratele at the Medical Research Council has been doing some really interesting work about it, is the stuff around pro-violence masculine norms and also community norms, with a sort of sense of that there is about what it's like to be a man and promotes kind of violence. It was kind of things that Sebastian was talking about, exposure to media and what's being promoted in terms of violent role models. And this sort of area of research is quite underexplored. But I really want to talk about this illegal firearms component, because this kind of talks to control and what sort of impacts we've been having. And our understanding of illegal firearms in South Africa and where they come from. So in the sort of late 1990s, there was a lot of focus on it's guns coming across the border. It's guns from Mozambique. It's the AKs that are coming from Mozambique. Some are coming from Angola. And that sort of conversation started to change very quickly when I think it was within the Civilian Secretariat, I think it was the Secretariat for Safety and Security at the time, brought out, the National Crime Prevention Center brought out data that actually showed that most gun crime in South Africa, particularly interpersonal gun crime, was committed by handguns. The vast majority. And in the kind of guns that were coming across the border into rural KwaZulu-Natal and into parts of Gauteng, most of those were assault rifles. And actually, when they looked at the data, only a small number of injuries and crimes were being committed with these types of firearms, particularly sort of cash and transit hijackings and cash and transit robberies and bank robberies. But most gun crime was committed with handguns, and certainly this stuff was not being smuggled in. The stuff was being sourced domestically, and it was getting sourced from licensed civilian firearm owners. It was being sourced from the police, private security companies. And there's recent data that's been released that kind of gives us a breakdown from sort of 1999 to 2015 and indicates that most firearms that become illegal were actually legal at one point in time. So they were lost or stolen. And the sort of the amount we're looking at is about 200,000 that kind of were lost or stolen by legal owners over this particular period of time. And, in terms of, if you look at the data in terms of what the border police are confiscating, very small numbers of weapons that are coming across the border. Actually, in terms of reports that one sees is in places like Zimbabwe, Botswana, and Namibia, guns that are being used in crime there come from South Africa. So actually the trend is kind of reversed in many respects. And it's, the thing that I've been looking at for a number of years is trying to understand the illegal firearm economy. And we only can really pick up anecdotal kind of evidence about this, and understanding how does someone who commits a murder with an illegal firearm, how do they get their firearm? So there's essentially, in very sort of crude ways, two pathways that happen. There's one, it's you steal the firearm, you use the firearm to kill someone, or the firearm is stolen or it's misplaced, someone finds it and enters the economy, and then it's a type of broker or facilitator, a business person, who will then sell that firearm on, rent that firearm on. So we know in terms of the illegal firearm economy that there's people who buy firearms and those who rent them. So this could even be, in terms of illegal firearms, it can be policemen who are renting out their weapons, private security guards who are renting out their weapons. But the sense of around, there was some ethnographic work, focus group discussion work that was done by the late Margie Keegan, Gun Free South Africa, that did focus group discussions in certain areas and asked people around, where do you get illegal guns in your neighborhood? And, there was a long list. Shebeen owners, taxi drivers, and get them from corrupt police officials. There's someone who's got a shop down the road who has a number of arms I can kind of buy from. So this kind of sense of, this economy exists. It's been, up until I think a few years ago, cheaper to get an illegal firearm than it would be a legal firearm. And also it's very difficult to get a legal firearm in South Africa, certainly since 2004. What I want to talk about, and sort of I've been exploring in recent years, and I think where one can find some explanations for this drop, is to look at the role of police. Obviously the Act makes provision for what the police can do, but I'm interested in the police operations. And I'm particularly interested in the big operations. So we have one happening at the moment that I'm sure all of us are familiar with, Operation Fiela. But Operation, and a lot of people are getting very upset about Operation Fiela. It's about harassing, arresting, deporting undocumented, non-South African kind of document holders, sending them back to their countries of origin. But the South African police have been doing this for a very long time. They've been doing it for more than 20 years. They've been doing it since 1994. And just as a bit of background to this, sort of where I got to this particular point of analysis, is there's a very sort of robust area of literature in the US called hotspots policing or place-based policing that's gone through kind of Campbell reviews. And what the literature and the research has done is run a series of experiments. So you've had academics working with police in specific cities, in specific blocks, in specific neighborhoods, looking at the impact of dedicated, focused patrols, focused police interventions, and seeing what impact that has on crime levels. So these particular experiments have shown that increased policing presence, dedicated, focused, actually results in a kind of short to medium term reduction in crime levels. So there's a whole literature and vocabulary that goes with it. I don't think there was, this is literatures and the sort of developments are actually happening around the same time South Africa's implementing these operations, but I don't think there was much engagement with this literature from the South African police point of view. But certainly, my analysis of it is these big operations have been informed by apartheid legacies and even colonial legacies of policing. So basically what's happened in South Africa since 1996 is these big operations have been launched. And what they've effectively entailed is they use the term saturation. Saturate high crime areas with police and military. So SAPS, the SADF, go in, cordon and search, break down doors, arrest people, seize firearms, seize drugs, look for the most wanted people who are on the most wanted list and arrest them. And the sort of motivation for this, and it was put up front to be sort of looking at the literature in the sort of 1996, 1997, was, we want to go in, we want to stabilize these areas so actually kind of crime prevention work can happen. Because at the sort of the time in the sort of mid to late 1990s, there was this sort of conflict going on where, sort of new government, new thinking, we needed a national crime prevention strategy, and a really good document was put together about, You know, if we want to tackle crime properly, everyone needs to come to the party. It's not just a policing problem, it's a health problem, it's an education problem, it's, you know, a social development problem. But what effectively happened is it didn't really make much sense to the police, so they developed their own strategy, which was the National Crime Combating Strategy, and ultimately led to these particular operations. And here are some of the ones that, you know, we know quite a bit about. So there was, you know, very kind of martial titles, Sword and Shield, Crackdown, and then there was the big operation around firearms was Saturnia 2003-2004. And from what one reads in terms of what the police are saying about these things, is they try and improve on, after the end of an operation, for the next one, they try and make it better. So I really want to I've got a few graphs here just to kind of show a relationship. And the one thing that, when I'm thinking about operations around, are there any indicators that can show impact? And after thinking about this, an indicator which I had pretty much ignored, and I think most people had ignored, and thought, you know, this has no explanatory power whatsoever, was to look at the category of illegal, or what's now called unlawful possession of arms and ammunition. It's basically around, it's typically where the police will encounter a person or engage in an operation and they don't have a firearm license, they have a firearm on their possession or in their vicinity, so in their house or their car, and that firearm, they cannot produce a firearm license for it, or there's no serial number on the firearm. And when I started to look at this data, and I'm looking at sort of in this presentation, Gauteng, Western Cape, and KwaZulu-Natal. When you start looking at this data and going into specific areas with high levels of crime, but also where the operations are being conducted, one starts to see some really interesting dynamics that are emerging. So you can see the purple line here is the unlawful possession of arms and ammunition, and the blue line is the murder rate. So we don't have, unfortunately, these are numbers. When they do it at the station level, they only produce total numbers. They don't give us a rate per 100,000. So I'm using SAP station level data just to look at trends here. So this is Gauteng, all stations in Gauteng, and you can see murder rate starting to drop, and then very kind of crudely the unlawful possession of arms and ammunition, the kind of numbers going up, and then they kind of sort of stabilize and plateau around there. But for me, the interesting things is you can see around sort of 99, kind of, you know, between 98, 99, 2000, kind of quite a strong increase in there, then a dramatic increase around 2003, 2004. And for me, these are kind of quite clear indications of these major firearm operations, these major operations that are going on. They're going and they're looking for illegal firearms in addition to stolen vehicles and those kind of things. So sort of interesting indications, as you can see, sort of, you know, quite dramatic drops in murder rate and murder numbers at specific points in time that have kind of a correlation to this particular rate. And it gets more interesting as we start looking at specific areas. So somewhere like Alexandra, you know, you've got a massive drop-off in the number of murders and dramatic increases in illegal possession around here. And it's sort of interesting as you can see that it goes up, the murder rate comes down, but when the number of illegal possession of arms and ammunition starts to go down, namely the operations go down, the murder rate goes up a bit, and then if that gets escalated, the murder rate goes down again. So it's a really interesting dynamic in a place that is, you know, seen as quite a dangerous place in terms of high levels of crime for people who live there. And it's just sort of a similar dynamic in a place like Hillbrow. Also, dramatic increase in the number of illegal arms and ammunition cases, decrease in the number of firearm cases, and you can sort of see as the numbers of illegal cases of firearms go down, you start to see a slight upswing here. But the advantage here is that looking at from over a 20-year period to see these particular trends. So there's a very interesting picture emerging here. Similar case in Katlehong. I think there's something going on with reporting in latter periods. I think there might be a new SAP station in the area that's kind of influenced this. But certainly in these sort of areas, a very similar dynamic. And then sort of KwaZulu-Natal, also we're seeing a similar effect happening here. It's obviously in terms of, you know, the fact you're not seeing so much the effect because this is in the thousands, but you can see murder rate coming down. I mean, one has in KZN, one has to be careful, one has to really look after 1998 because effectively there was internal armed conflict still going on in KwaZulu-Natal up until the peace agreement was signed between the IFP and the ANC in 1999. So we're looking from there, you can see a sort of dynamic in place. So looking at somewhere like Ananda as well, and this is kind of really interesting for me because it's this kind of case of has to reach a certain level before it starts having a dramatic impact on the murder rate. So you can the murder numbers. So you can see increases here under the sort of Operation Sword and Shield and Crackdown, and has an effect here, and then the number of murders pop up again. So they, more operations go, and then eventually the kind of rate starts to come down, but then it picks up again as they kind of ease pressure. Similar case in Umlazi. Also looking at from sort of 1998 and beyond, you can see kind of dramatic decrease here when they start to escalate the operations and from sort of 2008, 2009. Don't want to go through everything. I think just Richmond is also an interesting case. There's much smaller numbers of murders and cases of illegal possession of firearms, but here is an indication of a dedicated operation that happened in Richmond. This is sort of Sifiso and Kabinda and his colleagues, and the sort of small-scale war that was happening in Richmond at that particular time. So the dedicated operation was sent in, confiscated lots and lots of firearms, arrested quite a few people, and as you can see, the murder rate drops from that particular point in time. But I'm not saying that this is that the SAPS operation is the only factor in here, but it's a major dynamic that's happening in many of these places. In Western Cape, we've got some data out of the recent report that was mentioned yesterday about numbers of firearm murders in the Western Cape. So we know sort of roughly in sort of the late 90s was around 1,000. So I've just sort of marked it there. But then we sort of, the data that we have from 2004 is, it's somewhere, above between 500 and 1,000, and it increases and then decreases a bit before the recent upswing in firearm murders. And I just want to look at a few areas here in terms of what's been identified as high firearm murder places, such as Bishop Lavis. And as you can see, fairly high murder number. Operations are launched, it starts to come down, and dramatic increases in kind of police presence and operations in this particular area, and it seems to kind of have an effect on the murder number here, but then it starts to drop off and one sees the kind of number of murders start to increase again. Mitchell's Plain as well, lots of dedicated police operations happening here, number of murders going down, but this is an interesting dynamic here around, despite high levels of kind of cases of illegal arms and ammunition, the murder rate, number of murders are starting to increase quite dramatically. Similar dynamic in Inyanga. So really it's, what does this say? It's sort of, my reading of all these particular graphs, and I've just presented, 9 or 10 here, and I think one looks across at, many other areas, and I've kind of been plotting all this out and trying to understand it, is the same effect exists in many other policing stations with high murder numbers. So just to kind of emphasize what's being noticed here is there's a close correlation, I've almost done, close correlation between the number of murders and the illegal possession of arms and ammunition, and it seems to be that when the number of cases of illegal arms and ammunition go up, the number of murders come down. When illegal arms and ammunition cases plateau, the number of murders seem to plateau. When the illegal arms and ammunition go down, the murder rate seems to go up, or number of murders seems to go up. And it's around, what, I won't get into that, and it's around what is the kind of implications of this? And how is this working? What is the mechanism? Why? How can we use this explanation of illegal arms and ammunition on murder? And I think very crudely what we're seeing is young men who are at high risk of committing homicide are typically being arrested. They have illegal firearms or in their vicinity of illegal firearms, or they're being arrested for stolen vehicles, or they're on the most wanted list, or they have drugs. So when these operations happen, these high-risk young men are taken out of these particular neighborhoods and they're incarcerated for a certain period of time. It might be a few months, it might be a few years, and also the illegal firearms are taken out of these particular areas. So that's why we possibly see these kind of dynamics taking place. Also in the background we've seen, and this is where I think the effect of the Firearms Control Act has come in policing operations in that regard, is that it significantly slowed the acceleration of the rate of legal firearms into the illegal sector. And that was just that graph. You can sort of see these are the number of firearm losses from civilians, and that kind of rate has kind of decelerated over time. Also, the police operations in terms of collecting the firearms have kept pace. So there's less and less illegal firearms that are out there. So really, in kind of summary, I think the Firearms Control Act is a really important framework. I think it's contributed to long-term consequences. I just don't think it's had as direct effects as we think it's had. I think the kind of we need to be focusing more on what's happening in specific areas where there's high levels of murders. I also noticed similar dynamics around attempted murder and robbery under aggravated circumstances, but are less reliable statistics. So this is really just sort of my thinking on this issue at the moment, and really kind of some food for thought. But also it's quite depressing in many senses. If this is actually what's the reason for the drop in the murder rate, the implications is that big policing operations are clearly the way to go from a government point of view. Government know their work. They constantly laud it in the media. If we listen to what government's saying about Fiela is working, Fiela is bringing down crime, Fiela is stabilizing neighborhoods. And I think also an implication of this was Marikana, because if your response to serious crime problems, when a point that Johnny Steinberg made, Johnny Steinberg made in a book he did for the ISS about 10 years ago, he said when a large police force that's relatively weak at community level but strong at a national headquarters level, if it needs to deliver, it delivers through major operations where it can be driven from the national level. You go and you have an impact and you leave. And certainly what the College Commission of Inquiry showed us is that policing in communities, high violence communities, is highly problematic. So the kind of sort of sense from, and government knows this, and the Minister of Police knows this, and the kind of sense around the only way to deal with crime and be seen to deal with crime effectively is through these large operations, which have a series of negative consequences, as we've seen. So let me leave it at that. Sorry for going over time.
Thank you very much, Guy. You're lucky you're the boss, otherwise I would have cut you short a bit earlier. So Guy's given us some tasty vegetarian morsels to debate later. Some rather controversial things. I think the suggestion that large militarized interventions are making us safer obviously is very scary. I think an interesting question is, do South Africans long for coercion, or do we long for freedom? And there's the sense, Kelly was saying, there's this nostalgia for street committees, and it's kind of a nostalgia for coercion of one's private space. And we want more police, we want the bad guys to be caught, but we never want to be the victims. And the reality is that these things make victims of as many innocents as they do of apparently guilties. But I'm sure we'll have an interesting conversation about that later. Now we're going to move from deadly little bullets to big...
Is possibly giving you a bit of an insight into the study of forensic biomechanics, specifically relating to the forces and trauma associated with blunt force trauma to the lateral portion of the skull. The work that I'm going to be talking to you about today is a bit of a summary of the work I've been doing over the past few years in the Division of Forensic Medicine, and has been conducted in association with BISRU, which is the Blast Impact and Survivability Research Unit in the Department of Mechanical Engineering at UCT. So, unfortunately, we live in a world where homicidal assault is a daily occurrence, and as has been mentioned several times, this is a leading cause of death. And blunt force trauma forms a portion of these deaths. Yesterday we had Courtney speaking about the prevalence of blunt force trauma in South Africa, so I don't want to elaborate too much on that, other than to say that I don't think we should make the mistake of neglecting blunt force trauma, even though the portion is quite low compared to what we're seeing in firearm-related deaths. I think it's still important to conduct research in this area. Just a bit of insight into what happens in other parts of the world. In India, for example, between 1998 and 2000, blunt force trauma formed 41% of unnatural deaths, of which 80% involved the head. In England, 26% of non-firearm related deaths were due to blunt force trauma, and the majority of these cases involved multiple blows. So clearly the head is an important area to investigate. Experts investigating such cases in court are often asked questions relating to the number and sequence of blows, the point of impact or impacts, the ability of a type of trauma to threaten life, what sort of implement was used to inflict the trauma, as well as the amount of force or energy used to cause a specific type of trauma. And it's this last question that I'm interested in answering. So considering this, it is surprising that relatively few studies have attempted to relate the level of trauma to the amount of force or energy involved. And one of the purposes of forensic science is to provide objective, repeatable results. However, answering the question about force at the moment relies on experience gained from previous cases, as well as the use of an arbitrary subjective rating scale such as mild, moderate, or severe force. Furthermore, it's also interesting to note that even fewer studies have attempted to relate the amount of force associated with impact due to specific blunt force instruments. The majority of research which has been conducted has been done in an attempt to improve the safety standards in the automotive industry as well as the sporting industry. And most of the research which has been conducted on specific implements in blunt force trauma has mostly been done in the form of case studies, and often these studies do not look at the amount of force involved with a particular trauma. The aim of the current study was to determine a suitable animal model for cranial biomechanics testing. The reason for this is that most of the research has been conducted on humans. However, relatively little research has looked into suitable animal models, and human specimens are becoming more and more difficult to acquire for such research. The objectives of the tests were to determine the amount of force associated with lateral blunt force trauma, as well as the wound morphology in both the hard tissue as well as the soft tissue. So biomechanical testing has been conducted since the mid-1800s, and as such, numerous methodologies have been used. One of the most common methodologies is the use of a drop test, which is pictured over there. Now, in a drop test, a mass is lifted to a height and allowed to fall to impact with the specimen. In these cases, force is typically measured using Newton's second law, which states that force is equal to mass times acceleration, acceleration being gravitational acceleration. Or another method is by placing force transducers underneath the specimen being impacted. The problem I find with these tests is that they do not typically resemble a blunt force blow, as would occur in homicide. They're more akin to a crushing force. Another test which is commonly used is that of freefall tests, similar to the drop test. However, instead of a weight being lifted, it is the actual specimen which is raised to a height and dropped. Problem with these tests, we are finding that the forces which occur in such tests are much higher than seen in other testing. And the reason for this is that the mass of the entire body of the specimen is behind the impact. Therefore, there's an increase in force. The third methodology which is commonly used is that of a pendulum configuration, whereby a mass is attached to a pendulum arm, it is raised to a height and released to impact with the specimen, which may or may not be attached to a secondary pendulum arm. The problem with all of these tests is that they all use gravitational acceleration to impart a blow. And as such, relatively little research, or in fact no research, has been conducted on impacts at velocities greater than 10 meters per second. To date, besides the work that I've been doing, only one other group of researchers has attempted to do this. So the specimens we used in the current study, we used 30-hole porcine heads as well as 30-hole baboon heads, and these specimens were subjected to a single impact test to the parietal region, which in the baboon specimen is that area over there, and in the porcine specimen, that's that area over there. Before testing, all the specimens were palpated and visually inspected to ensure that there were no fractures present before testing. During testing, the specimens were suspended upside down by means of an adjustable suspension system, and this ensured or limited the chance of false fractures occurring. It has previously been shown that rigid restraint of specimens during impact testing results in more fractures occurring, as well as more fractures occurring remote to the site of impact. Furthermore, the system allowed us to easily adjust the specimen to ensure perpendicular impact to the parietal region. The tests were divided up into two main test types. Firstly, it was the hammer tests, which were utilized to determine the amount or the types of trauma we would see, as well as the Hopkinson pressure bar test, which were mostly utilized to determine the amount of force. In both of these tests, the specimens were divided up into three different impact conditions according to velocity of impact. That was condition A at approximately 10 meters per second, B at approximately 15 meters per second, and condition C at approximately 25 meters per second. In the hammer test, what we did was we machined an implement which was designed to resemble the shape and impact diameter of a hammer. It had a mass of 200 grams and an impact diameter of 20 millimeters. Now, this implement was fired from a gas gun and allowed to impact with the specimen. The Hopkinson pressure bar tests, as I mentioned, we utilized these to determine the amount of force. Now, the Hopkinson pressure bar is an apparatus which was first described by Bertram Hopkinson in 1914 and is commonly used in material testing. So the setup that we used is pictured over here. So basically what happens is the striker bar, which we utilize in the hammer test, is used again, and it is fired from the gas gun. However, instead of impacting directly with the specimen, it impacts this bar over here, which is the Hopkinson pressure bar. And this bar then subsequently impacts the specimen. So how do we measure force from this? So the way we do that is through one-dimensional stress wave theory. So basically what happens is that the striker bar is fired from the gas gun and this impacts the Hopkinson pressure bar. This generates a stress wave which travels down the length of the bar and interacts with the specimen. Now, due to an impedance mismatch, the stress wave is partially reflected back down the length of the bar. In the center of the bar, we have strain gauges which record these stress waves as they move back and forth along the bar. And this produces a plot of the voltage over time. Now, applying physical equations to this plot, we can determine, among other things, the amount of force, the amount of energy, as well as the displacement associated with a particular impact. So, on to the results. In terms of soft tissue damage, in the porcine specimen, 91% of the impacts resulted in laceration, and the main types of laceration that we saw were deep linear lacerations, superficial circular lacerations, deep circular lacerations, as well as irregular shaped deep lacerations. So the most common type were the deep circular lacerations, and these typically resembled the shape and size of the implement being used. In contrast to this, in the baboon specimens, only 40% of the impacts resulted in laceration. And these were typically superficial semicircular lacerations. Now, possibly a reason for this is the thick fur of the baboon may provide a protective role, as well as the skin of the baboon is incredibly tough, which may inhibit the production of lacerations. In terms of hard tissue damage, in the porcine specimen, 62% of the impacts resulted in fracture. Again, the main types of fractures which we saw were linear fractures, superficial depressed fractures, depressed fractures, and one specimen resulted in a depressed comminuted fracture. So the main type of fracture which we saw were these depressed fractures. However, they were typically just a circular plug of bone which was depressed, and under none of the tests were there any associated radiating fractures. And even in the specimens that resulted in linear fractures, these fractures were typically relatively small. The largest linear fracture, I think, was approximately 37 millimeters. In contrast to this, in the baboon specimen, 79% of the impacts results in fracture. One of the interesting types of fractures which we got in these specimens were fractures which occurred on the inner table of the skull with no associated trauma seen on the outer portion of the skull. These were typically in the form of a missing bone plug, or as pictured over here, these very fine linear fractures which were approximately 4 millimeters in length. They were very small. So these do occur in humans, but are typically rare. I don't know if it's possibly rare because you don't typically look for them. As I mentioned, they're small, so you wouldn't. The only reason I noticed it was purely by accident, and then I started looking for them and started finding them. So the mechanics associated with how the skull fractures in blunt force trauma would kind of explain why these fractures occur. So bone is an anisotropic material, which means that it exhibits different properties when it is loaded in different directions. And basically, bone is weaker under tension compared to compression. Now, when a bone is subject to blunt force impact, it bends inwards and there's an area of tension on the inner table of the bone. So it makes sense that the bone would fracture first on the inner table. Some of the other fractures which we got in these tests were, again, linear fractures, depressed comminuted fractures, full penetrating fractures, as well as one specimen which resulted in a diastatic fracture. For those of you that don't know, a diastatic fracture is separation of the suture bones, or of the suture between two bones. These, again, typically do not occur in blunt force trauma in adult humans. unless due to crushing forces. However, they can be found in young children, and in fact, the specimen which has occurred was a juvenile specimen. The main fracture type which we saw were linear and the full penetrating fractures, and interestingly, 89% of the depressed and full penetrating fractures had associated radiating fractures. These results can be compared to tests done on humans. As I mentioned, only one other group of researchers, that's Raymond and colleagues from Wayne State University in Detroit, have conducted experiments at greater than 10 meters per second. So their setup was pretty similar to ours in that they used an aluminium striker which had a mass of 103 grams and an impact diameter of 38 millimeters. And they fired this from a gas gun to impact the parietal region of suspended human specimens. The first group of tests was conducted at 20 meters per second, and the second group of tests was conducted on the other side of the head at 35 meters per second. And they found that under 20 meters per second impact, two of the 7 impacts resulted in fracture, of which one was a linear fracture and the other a depressed comminuted fracture. At 35 meters per second, 5 of the 7 impacts resulted in fracture, and all of these were depressed comminuted fractures. In terms of fracture force, the mean force in the baboon study was 7,557 newtons, and very similarly in the porcine study we found a mean fracture force of 7,760 newtons. Now this graph depicts the fracture forces obtained in all the studies previously conducted on lateral impacts to the head, which have mostly been conducted on human tests. So as you can see from this graph, it compares relatively well to the previous experiments. This graph also depicts quite nicely what I was saying earlier about free-fall tests resulting in larger fracture forces. For instance, the study over here, those were free-fall tests, and as you can see, the peak fracture forces were relatively high. And although this test over here was not free-fall test, in this case it was a drop test. However, the impactor that they used was a 12 kilogram steel plate with an impact area of 50 centimeters squared. So it makes sense that the forces would be a lot higher than in other tests. One of the interesting things which happened in our results, which I think speaks to the variability of both humans and animal tissue, is ironically in both the porcine test and in the baboon test, the highest forces which we obtained did not result in fracture. It was approximately, I think, 11,400 newtons in the porcine specimen and 12,600 in the baboon specimen. In conclusion, as I mentioned, the production of fractures are influenced by a wide range of factors, and it appears that determining if a correlation exists between force and the level of trauma is problematic. So in the porcine study, we found that none of the data correlated to the amount of trauma or the level of trauma. However, there was a slight correlation emerging between velocity of the impact and the associated trauma. In the baboon specimens, there was no correlation between the force of impact and the level of trauma. However, correlations were found between the energy of impact as well as the velocity of impact. So it appears that energy may be a better predictor of the level of trauma. And this kind of makes sense because it's not necessarily the force which is causing the trauma, it's the absorption of the energy which causes trauma. Problem with this comes in with people that don't deal with energy on a regular basis. They can't comprehend it so well, because if I say to you a impact resulted in a force of 2,000 newtons, you can think to yourself, okay, well, that's about 200 kilograms if I remember back to school days, so yeah, that seems like quite a lot. If I say to you, well, that same impact resulted in 56 kilojoules of energy, I'm going to get a blank stare. However, though, the fracture forces which we did obtain compare relatively well to the literature. And our final conclusion is that from these tests, we can see that the baboon specimens appear to be a better model for cranial blunt force trauma in terms of the hard tissue damage. The fractures which we're seeing in the porcine specimens do not typically resemble those seen in humans. However, the porcine specimens appear to be a better model for the soft tissue damage. Thank you. I'd just like to acknowledge the NRF for funding, as well as Winelands Pork and Cape Nature for procurement of the specimens. Thanks.
Thank you, Calvin. So, 2 presentations on firearms and 1 very technical presentation on the kinds of force that can be inflicted on our skulls. We've got half an hour for conversation, questions, and then we'll break. Can I have an indication? We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Let's take those 5 and then we'll come back for some more.
Thanks, very interesting presentations. My question is in relation, it's lighthearted enough. In terms of visualization of the impact energy, have you ever looked at, or can you actually tell us if the impact energy of the number of homicides in the Western Cape was turned into a kilojoule? What type of lighting would we have for load shedding incidents? In terms of visualization, in terms of, you know, the number versus what we could get.
Hi there, Bronwyn Davies, forensic toxicologist. Thanks for the presentations, those were fantastic. Calvin, this is for you. I just wanted to know, how did you account for the mass of the body of an individual in these situations in your particular tests? Thank you for the presentations. I confess, Calvin, your presentation literally did my head in. I just keep thinking, you know, how does one have to actually calculate the amount of force when you see a person suffering from multiple force injuries as well? And thank you for the other presentations. Just a couple of comments in relation to the firearms thing and Guy's analysis of the increase of firearms, unlawful firearms confiscations possibly, and the reduction in murder. And I think it also relates to Ansi's presentation yesterday, is that we see this vacillating line in terms of the unlawful possession of firearms cases. We assume that they're all confiscated and hopefully not given back to the perpetrator, but it would appear that there's very few convictions that is actually followed through. So at least they are taken out of circulation. But my other question is really, do we really know how those firearms were actually, those cases were brought against those people in what circumstances? Yes, there might be a linkage between the massive operations and the regular stop and search, but also in conversation with police, they indicate that a lot of that comes through investigation of other cases. So where people have, suspects are alleged to have perpetrated a firearm-related crime, then an investigation occurs and the firearm is subsequently confiscated and another crime is brought against the person as well. Just in terms also of the intensive policing operations, I've also listened to a presentation by the city of, what do they call it, an intensive operation in Manenberg with saturation policing through the city, through cooperation between city law enforcement and the SAPs, and claiming very successful and impressive results in bringing down the murder rate completely through a period of a month.
Hi, name is Sipon Folozi. I'm a forensic pathologist from the University of Cape Town. Just have a few comments and questions for Guy's presentation. The first one relates to the saturation operations that you mentioned, typically in operations like Fiela. I just wanted to make a comment that, you know, such operations have the same effect or kind of effect as a temporary roadblock or temporary traffic camera where the effect is palpable when the camera's there, but once the camera is picked up and the officer leaves, then everything goes back to normal. So I think, you know, it's inefficient in that sense that the effects are only visible when the operation is ongoing and afterwards everything goes back to normal. And secondly, in our experience, most of the SAPS members who are stationed in the police stations, such in those places, are from that community, and it most likely happens that they know the gangsters, they went to school with them, and so on. So the will and the determination to change is just, you know, we grew up here. When we were kids, this was happening. now I'm a policeman, but I know so and so, and you know the will is not there to make a change. The second point that I wanted to talk about is firearms controls and establishment of a firearm database. You know, we know that there are databases that are being established for things like DNA of individuals. And I have said to someone for a number of years now that we could establish a firearm database in South Africa where each firearm at the point of purchase is fired once, the projectile is recovered, and a rifling profile of that firearm is kept in a police database, so that in the future, when an unknown projectile is involved in a crime, that profile can be looked at and compared to a database to see if it's been involved. I think it's not difficult to establish such a database, but I have no one to go to shout this idea to. So hopefully in this forum today, someone would take that up. The third and final comment that I have relates to an approach of thinking outside the box in terms of prevention of illegal firearms. The firearms themselves are not illegal. It's the person who's using them who doesn't have the license to use the firearm. And even in that aspect, it's the usability of the firearm once it's in the hands of a person who's not supposed to use it. In other words, firearms should not be usable to someone who is not authorized to use a firearm. I mean, I'm talking now outside of what we hear about. You know, there are certain advancements in this field where a firearm is equipped with a locking mechanism, which is either mechanical, where you put a combination that is known to yourself and you make the firearm usable only when that combination is set, or things like fingerprint scanners, which can be small enough to work in firearms. So I think that, you know, innovators and inventors who can have an impact in firearm design could play a big role in making firearms unusable to people that are not supposed to have access to them.
Thanks very much. I think there was, oh yes, there's one more hand in the front and then we'll come back to the panel.
My question's for Calvin. I might have missed this, but I'm not sure what the utility of the Hopkins bar is. I know you mentioned earlier the need for objective assessment. So would it assist in, for example, like forensic witness testimony? What exactly is the utility?
Oh, thanks very much. Shall we start with Calvin and then work our way back this way?
All right, thank you for the questions. In terms of the first question, I may have misunderstood you, but you're asking about the sort of energy and forces we're seeing in actual cases in the Western Cape. Is that correct? Okay, sorry. Yeah, so I'll answer my own question then. So I think what we need to do is, when we have enough answers to this sort of research, is start educating people in terms of energy as opposed to force, so that we can get a better understanding of what is actually occurring in terms of blunt force trauma, particularly to the head. The other questions in terms of accounting for mass in the body, it is somewhat difficult. As I mentioned, some of the tests have been conducted using whole intact bodies, and others have been conducted using isolated heads. We utilize isolated heads, and we use the suspension system. So the reason for that is, although in reality your neck would provide some sort of resistance, at this point I don't think we're ready to sort of quantify that resistance or attempt to replicate it. And in the previous tests, which have used some sort of restraint, they were finding fractures which could not be explained by natural phenomena. So it's it's because of this restraint that they're getting more fracturing, as well as fractures occurring remote to the site of impact. So they would impact on the left-hand side, and there would only be fractures on the right-hand side. So obviously this is more of a crushing force than an actual blunt force blow. So I think there's a lot of scope in this research to go further. So in terms of the mass of the actual heads that we used, the typical human head is between 4 and 5 kilograms. So in the porcine specimens, we actively sought out specimens of that mass. In the baboon specimens, obviously, we're limited to what we can get. So what we did there is we actually placed gel packs inside of the netting as well, alongside the head, to increase the mass of the head such that it weighed approximately 4 kilograms. As to your question about the utility of this research, so as I mentioned at the moment, typically when these questions get asked in court about the force, it's answered in terms of a rating scale. It was mild force or moderate or severe force. And the problem with this is that it is very objective, and it relies a lot on the experience of the person testifying from previous cases. So the objective of this research is to try and quantify that. Now, I understand that the objective isn't really to give a specific amount of force or energy to a specific trauma. I would rather prefer to see that we actually quantify the scaling level. So we say, okay, a moderate force is between X and Y, and a large force is between Z and A or whatever. And in so doing, we can possibly see if there was actually intent to cause harm, or if it may possibly have been an accident. If we're finding sort of that, okay, a certain type of trauma is actually occurring at relatively low energy and force levels, then it is possible that it could have been a mistake, or not a mistake, an accident. Thank you.
Let me respond to some of the questions and comments. Let me take the technical comments first. There's good news. There's a Firearm Control Amendment Bill that's sitting before the Parliamentary Portfolio on Police, that one of the key amendments is for all new firearms to go through a ballistics fingerprinting process. So will actually go into a database. But when we start looking at firearms control, and it's not as severe as it is in the US, but it's a highly emotional, highly politicized process. And what's happening within South Africa around ballistics fingerprinting is there's a massive pushback from the gun lobby. So the South African Gun Owners Association, Gun Owners of South Africa, and many other sort of hunting groups are pushing back on this and have been lobbying the committee and lobbying the deputy minister to say that this is a really bad idea. And the argument is that the technology is flawed, it's not 100% accurate. And the thing is that it's basing it on some US studies and possibly quoting them out of context. So those who are pro-gun control like myself and others who will sort of make representations and say, well, you should consider this, but we don't have the scientific background to say that. And I think what would be really helpful to an audience like this would be to write letters of support or write to the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee and say this is a really good idea. And the science is never going to be perfect. But ballistic fingerprinting has been implemented in certain US states. The South African Police Service do it for their service firearms, so that if those firearms end up being used in crime, they can try and trace it back and find out where the weaknesses are. It's the same thing around the technologies that are in place to try and prevent a weapon that is licensed or legal then being used by someone else who isn't licensed to use it. And there was a new smart gun that was rolled out, I think, last year in the US, which uses biometrics. So you can only fire the weapon if it's, you're the person whose biometrics are on it. So it's the same like to locks and those kind of things. But a massive pushback from the National Rifle Association on that, in the sense of around, this is, I can't even see the rationality in many of their arguments, but it resulted in that particular gun pretty much being marginalized. Additional things within South Africa as well, the new amendment bill says that all firearms need to have microdots put on them because they've had success within the vehicle thefts in terms of tracking weapons and finding out who the original owners were and figure out what happened, why that weapon was stolen or how it was stolen. And also massive pushback from the gun lobby on that, and sort of arguments against cost, saying it's ineffective. So one's dealing with different set of emotions and different perceptions on the world, and it's sort of this kind of sense the state's going to take our guns away and they're going to be murdered in our bed. That's the kind of mindset that often affects some of the more kind of conservative gun lobby groups throughout the world. And then Amanda, this sort of conversation about your comments about saturation and the kind of illegal possession kind of thing. I'm still trying to understand this and explore this. And for me, it's an indication, just to go back and emphasize this sort of brief point I made in the presentation about, it's an indication of police arresting predominantly young men at high risk in these particular areas. So we don't know in terms of how reliable other rates are in terms of illegal drug possession, because they're going and they're arresting a lot of people. And firearms is a key component, so they're arresting people who have to have firearms on them or ammunition on them that they don't have a license for. We don't know what happens to those people, but I mean, one can sort of assume that they don't have a lot of money, a lot of resources, so they're in police custody for a while, maybe go to a waiting trial, and as we know, I think from the Department of Community Safety's watching briefs that I know UWC, Lucas and his colleagues have been working with, that is an indication that the track record of getting a conviction on that isn't great. So I think this is clearly a hypothesis, is you're removing those, you're taking the guns out, so certainly there's less guns floating around that can be used, but also the individuals who potentially can use them. And they're taking them out for a while and they go back home. So that could possibly explain, where this kind of dips happen, because I know when sort of reading historical stuff about South African crime, you notice that violent crime or kind of serious crime in South Africa dipped during the World Wars. And the argument that those particular points in time was it was high-risk young men that went out to go and fight for Britain and fight for the Allies. And then when those men came back, one started to see the crime rate go up again. So it's that kind of very kind of crude argument. It's like if those who are at high risk of committing the crime are no longer in those areas, crime goes down, but once they're back, it starts going up. Just some very basic thoughts on that.
Thank you very much. I didn't get any question, but therefore I give a question to Thomas, or actually a comment to Calvin. A comment. The force is an objective measurement, but the strength of the skull is very different. So I think if you're in your future research, you should look and focus on that, because your temporal bone is by far the weakest. Your frontal is much stronger. Your occipital bone is about 10 times stronger. So the same force can be in the one person lethal and in the other one doing no harm at all. So if the victim is turning his head in such a way that the blow is received at a different part, then it can be lethal. So yesterday we talked about it, that the difference between murder and attempted murder is maybe is a few centimeters. So I just want to mention that. Also in children, I go to court quite regularly for children who have been abused. A neonate, they've got cartilaginous bone. It's not calcified, it's like your ear and your nose. So it's often thought that these bones are weaker. These bones are not weaker, they are stronger, because they're more elastic, so you can deform them to a larger extent before they break. So you need a significant force for any fracture in a child under the age of 1, because the bones, although they are more flexible and they look weaker, they're actually stronger.
Yes, thank you. I do. I fully agree with you. So one of the things that we have been looking at is a number of different factors. This includes, or at the moment we've just been looking at the actual thickness of the bone involved, which may play a role. But in future research, what I'm planning on doing is actually on the same specimens that we're doing these Hopkinson bar tests, I want to do actual further mechanical testing and determine the actual strength of the bone, as well as looking at bone density, as well as the mineral content of the bone, and placing all of these factors into a model and seeing which factors are associated with fracture. And I think that'll go a long way to helping us predict or determine the chance of a fracture occurring and different types of fracture occurring. And yes, there are differences in the neonate skull as well as the adult skull, and that's another further area that needs to be researched. In terms of research that has been done on neonates, it's very, very little research has been done. Only, I think, one group of researchers has looked at doing drop tests on what they call the infant skull, they used porcine bones. I don't really agree with the results that they came to, but they found that there were a lot of extensive fractures in drop tests.
Thanks. I think we've got time for about 4 more questions, if they can be quick questions, and we'll start with Elrina, Lizette, 3, 4. Okay. Thank you very much.
I have more of just a comment insofar as we are going to publish a booklet on research topics. So, Guy, I mean, this business of policing on steroids, saturation policing, is an integral part of the history of policing in this country. And that raises an interesting question as to whether policing on steroids in the latest round, to what extent that has very common features to the steroid policing we saw in the 80s with Caspers. And whilst you are particularly interested in the link between that form of policing and access to weapons and homicide, I mean, there seems to be a whole world of issues that we could explore. I mean, the symbolism of it all. You know, when do states decide to opt for this kind of steroid policing? Is there a continuity? What do we know about how these things happened in the past? And what are the effects on cops themselves, the spin-off effects, you know, of being on steroids over a weekend? What does it do to communities? What does it do to young men's perceptions of the pacification which is really aimed at their bodies? So, and we know very little about that in the South African context. I mean, apart from, I think, Monique Marks that has done a bit of work on this. And I don't know whether the pacification in the Latin American context would yield some insights into, so that one thinks more complexly and at different layers about the impact. Yes, it may have less guns on the streets, but there may be other kinds of, you know, coercive ideas and force being brewed in this kind of cocktail, which is so dramatic. Anyway, that was just a...
Thank you for that. This on, yes. I didn't understand anything, but thank you very much. Sebastian, that was amazing. I think you took a lot of very critical information, put it in one presentation that I think was very powerful. So, Guy, I think you have done something quite astonishing, and it's given us out-of-the-box thinking about this, which I think can be very valuable. Yeah, I think you need to explore this further, but we have to also, there could potentially be very strange correlations between culpable homicide and if you look at certain places, culpable homicide has an inverse correlation to murder rates. And I haven't looked at it in a station level, but I'm just saying that there might be more behind this than those those sort of apparent or correlations. I think we will also see interesting things with assault, despite it having nothing to do with this. So one has to just try and, it's the same thing we're battling with, how many things do you put in and what can you put in to just make sure that you're correct. Because we know, and there are many problems with the arrest rates that are reported by the police, but an 80% increase in the number of arrests in a decade, as opposed to a 20% drop in NPA finalizations, is shocking. And what happens to all these arrests? The police are very quick to sometimes say, oh, but it's repeat offenders, but the cases do not go to court. We are creating a society of criminals because because of the operations we are following. We are criminalizing the poor. And I think we must be just very careful how we report on these things. But I would also suggest that you speak to Monique Marks. She's got very interesting insight. She's dealing with these things at the moment. Thank you.
Thanks. Hi, Guy. I missed the very beginning of your presentation, so I'm sorry if I'm saying something that's unnecessary. What I was wondering is, at what geographical level are these large policing operations happening? And have you looked for displacement effects to surrounding stations?
Guy, I was just going to ask you if you could talk a bit about what you think the implications of your findings are for a larger crime prevention agenda, because, I mean, I think in some senses, I don't think I understand you as saying this is the way to go in terms of policing. But I think what you're raising is a more complex question, is that the reality is these kind of interventions are very politically expedient. And there's all these processes going on in terms of revision of white papers, etc., etc. And there's allegedly political support for that kind of crime prevention approach. But I mean, it's exactly what happened in the past, where the white paper on safety and security basically was ignored in favor of the national crime combating strategy. So, are we going to repeat the cycle again? Yeah.
Thanks, Vanessa. Okay, I'm going to ask for quick responses from everybody. I also have a quick question which I'm going to add for Sebastian, which is whether you have any thoughts on Guy's hypothesis. And I guess one way to test it would be to see if there's a correlation between his purple line and gunshot wounds at Red Cross. But let's go through. We're going to be a few minutes into our tea break, but we've got half an hour, so I think that's okay.
Thanks, Andrew. I'll be quick. Thanks for the comments. I mean, Elraina, I agree. It's sort of a whole area of big policing operations, other than what Monique Marks has been doing in her work on public order policing. Looking at public order policing, there's some research happening there, but none on these big operations. Hopefully with, Fiela getting so much attention that the, scholarship will start looking at this, because certainly when I'm looking at this particular area, that's part of kind of my PhD at the moment, is I'm still very much in the early stages, so I'm saying this is preliminary stuff. So in response to you and Nina, I think it would be fantastic to be able to see if there's displacement, but trying to get exact data out of, one needs to get data out of police to say which areas did you go into, what particular points in time we were there, and then one can look at surrounding policing precincts. But, here we're only dealing on an annual basis, and if you look at the US stuff on it, they're able to analyze it on a daily basis. So they have those experiments that they've done that can actually show impact. Then Vanessa, your question, question and comment here, it's, I think for me the really worrying and scary thing that pops out of this is that we really haven't had much of an effect on the terms of the crime prevention, non-aggressive crime prevention interventions that are there. And it's also, it comes back to the police are doing what the police always do, and they do what they're trying to do the best job they can, which is pretty much go in and arrest people. And so that's what they've been doing, and that's what they've been pursuing, and they've been doing it for decades. And this kind of sense of around it really shows that we need to be shifting our focus. Other government departments need to be seriously getting involved in crime prevention. The cops themselves have even said it. We go in to stabilize. Everyone else needs to come in and do their job once we've stabilized. And they said that in the mid-1990s, and they're still saying it. And the fact is other government departments are not coming to the party. And we're not sort of thinking. There's a lot of sort of thinking that's happening about it, and these policy documents that are coming out. But the real challenge is they're not really seeing clear implementation to the same extent that the police are doing their particular intervention work. So let me leave it at that.
Thanks. I think there's definitely space for comparing these big police actions to the number of shootings. We found that the majority of kids who were shot in Crossfire came from certain areas. So it's very easy. We've got this information, so you can easily correlate it. And on another note, I just would like to know that I really don't like this militarization of our society. I'm staying in Rondebosch, and I was just walking there last week, and I came across this soldier, but apparently, I thought it was a soldier, but it appeared to be an ADT, security guy. But it's in full combat outfit, helmet, a bulletproof vest, camouflage, and a large gun. And I really think it's a ridiculous environment to raise our kids with these soldiers walking through the suburbs.
Okay, great. We're not going to miss too much of our tea after all. I just want to say thanks very much to our panelists, Guy, Sebastian, and Calvin. Thanks very much. And I think we should all be back at 11 o'clock sharp, please. Maybe 5 to 11 if you think you'll be